Every year, more than 2 million people walk across the same stretch of limestone plaza in the Yucatan Peninsula to stand before one of the most photographed monuments on Earth. They come with cameras and guidebooks. They circle the great step pyramid the world knows as El Castillo, and they leave believing they've seen everything this ancient city has to offer. What almost none of them realize is that the ground beneath their sandals has been quietly rewriting the story of Chichén Itzá for decades, and some of what lies down there has only been fully understood in the last few years. This isn't a tale of buried gold or a pharaoh's curse. It's something better, a genuine scientific mystery, built out of radar pulses, electrical currents, and archaeologists crawling on their bellies through passages barely wide enough for a human shoulder. It's a story about a city that hits history in layers, tucking one secret inside another, and about the modern tools that finally let us look without lifting a single stone out of place. Let's start with what's actually underneath the pyramid itself, because that's where this whole investigation begins. To understand why Chichén Itzá conceals so much, you first have to understand where it sits. The northern Yucatan has almost no rivers on its surface. The entire landscape is a shell of porous limestone laid down over millions of years by ancient seas, and beneath that shell runs an enormous hidden network of water, caves, tunnels, and sinkholes called cenotes, some flooded, some dry, all connected in ways that are still being mapped today. For the people who built this city more than 1,000 years ago, that underground water wasn't just a resource. It was sacred. A cenote wasn't simply a well. It was understood as an opening into another realm entirely, a threshold where the world of the living touched whatever lay beneath it. Knowing that changes how you look at El Castillo. The pyramid rises about 30 meters above the plaza. For staircases, 9 terraces, a small temple at the summit. And for most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed they understood its structure completely. It had been measured, mapped, tunneled into. There didn't seem to be much left to discover. Then, in 2016, a team of Mexican researchers rolled specialized equipment across that same plaza and asked the ground a question nobody had thought to ask so precisely before. What exactly is underneath this pyramid? The method they use is called electrical resistivity tomography. In simple terms, the equipment pushes a weak electrical current into the earth and measures how much resistance that current meets as it travels. Solid limestone behaves one way, loose soil behaves another, and open, water-filled space behaves in a way that's unmistakable once you know what you're looking at. As the team built up their three-dimensional model of what sat beneath El Castillo, a shape began to emerge that had nothing to do with solid bedrock. Directly under the pyramid, in almost exactly the center, sat a large natural cavity filled with water, a cenote, swallowed whole by the limestone above it, invisible from the surface for centuries. This wasn't a construction flaw or a cellar someone dug and forgot about. It was a genuine underground pool, entirely natural, that had existed long before a single stone of the pyramid was laid. And that raises an obvious question. Did the Maya know it was there when they built on top of it? Almost certainly, yes. Researchers point out that the northern staircase of El Castillo is aligned toward the sacred cenote, the famous open sinkhole a short walk from the pyramid that was used for centuries as a site of offerings and pilgrimage. Put those two facts together. A pyramid built directly above a hidden cenote, oriented toward a second, visible one. And you're no longer looking at a coincidence. You're looking at a deliberate design. The builders of Chichén Itzá appear to have raised their most important temple as a kind of anchor point between two sources of sacred water, one they could see and one they couldn't. The resistivity scans revealed something else, and this is where the story gets stranger. Long before the 2016 survey, explorers in the 1930s had already tunneled into El Castillo and discovered that the pyramid everyone sees today isn't the only one. Buried inside is an earlier, smaller pyramid, built centuries before, that the later builders simply wrapped in new stone rather than tearing down. Inside that earlier structure sits a small shrine, and inside the shrine, a stone throne carved in the shape of a jaguar, painted red, its spots inlaid with pieces of jade, its eyes fitted with polished stone that still catches the light of a flashlight beam. Beside the throne, explorers found a reclining stone figure and the remains of objects left as offerings, a shrine that sat sealed and untouched inside the heart of the pyramid for centuries before anyone in the modern era laid eyes on it again. What the 2016 scans added to this picture was even more remarkable. Evidence of a third structure, older still, nested at the very core of the whole complex. 3 temples, one wrapped inside another, like a set of stone matryoshka dolls. Each generation of builders had chosen not to demolish what came before, but to enclose it, to preserve the old sacred center by burying it inside something newer and larger. The result is a monument that isn't really one pyramid at all. It's at least 3, stacked across different eras, each one hiding the one before it. While the pyramid was giving up its underground secrets, a very different discovery was unfolding a couple of miles to the east, one that started not with radar equipment, but with a group of farmers walking their land back in 1966. They noticed an opening in the limestone, a dark gap partly hidden by scrub vegetation, the kind of feature that shows up all over this porous landscape if you know where to look. When they investigated, what they found below the surface was unusual enough that they reported it to local authorities. An archaeologist was sent to inspect the opening, crawled inside, took notes and measurements, and quickly recognized that this was an ordinary cave, for reasons that were never fully recorded. Limited resources, a decision to protect the site, simple bureaucratic drift. The entrance was sealed back up, and the report describing what had been found was filed away and, over time, essentially forgotten, not destroyed, just misplaced in the way paperwork gets misplaced inside large institutions. Decades passed. The tourists kept coming to climb the pyramid a couple of miles away. Nobody remembered that a sealed passage nearby was still holding whatever farmers had glimpsed in 1966. That accidental neglect turned out to be the best possible outcome. By sealing the cave and losing the file, the site was protected far more effectively than any fence or guard could have managed. No looters ever found their way in. No well-meaning excavator hauled its contents into daylight and scrubbed them clean, the way earlier generations of archaeology often did. The cave simply waited in the dark, undisturbed, for more than 50 years. The story picked back up in 2018, when an underwater archaeologist working on a large-scale project to map the flooded cave systems beneath the Yucatan came across the old, half-forgotten records describing the 1966 discovery. The decision was made to go back, break the decades-old seal, and finally document what was inside. What the team found waiting for them was nothing like a Hollywood tomb. There was no grand entrance, no walkway to reach the first chambers. Archaeologists had to get down on their stomachs and drag themselves forward through passages so narrow their shoulders scraped against stone on both sides, the ceiling low enough to brush the backs of their necks. The air underground was cool, heavy, and completely still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Before anyone entered, the team paused and carried out a purification ritual. It wasn't part of the scientific protocol. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that whatever instruments and cameras they were about to use, they were entering a space the Maya had considered sacred, and that reverence didn't stop being appropriate just because the visitors now carried headlamps instead of torches. Then they went in, and their lights found the first offering. What the team encountered, chamber after chamber, was not a jumble of artifacts scattered by centuries of water and collapse. It was a series of deliberate arrangements, untouched since the moment they were placed. Incense burners stood exactly where hands had set them down 1,000 years earlier. Plates and vessels sat grouped in careful clusters. On the surfaces of the burners, dark soot marked precisely where resin had once been lit and left to smolder, the char still sharp-edged instead of worn away by time or water. This was not a tomb that had been raided and picked over. It looked, more than anything, like a room where the worshippers had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned to finish the ceremony. The researchers understood immediately what that meant for how they should proceed. This wasn't a treasure hunt, and it wasn't going to be handled like one. What made the site valuable wasn't any single object. It was a relationship between every object and every other object. Which items were grouped together, which burners faced which direction, how far apart the clusters sat from one another. That web of spatial information is exactly the kind of evidence that gets destroyed the instant someone starts picking things up and carrying them out. So the team made a choice that reflects how far archaeological practice has evolved. They would leave almost everything exactly where it lay. Instead of excavating in the traditional sense, they would map, photographing every angle, recording every measurement and building a complete three-dimensional digital model of the cave and its contents so the arrangement could be studied indefinitely without ever being physically disturbed. Only where testing genuinely required it, a trace of residue, a few grains of preserved seed, did they take the smallest possible sample. They gave the site a name that fit what they found: Balamká, the cave of the jaguar god. As the team pushed deeper through the branching tunnels, the scale of what had been sealed away kept growing. This wasn't a single small shrine with a handful of pots. The offerings kept appearing, one cluster, then another, eventually totaling more than 200 objects spread across at least 7 distinct offering areas. For comparison, a nearby ritual cave excavated decades earlier, using older methods, had yielded only around 70 items, and much of the delicate evidence surrounding those objects, the soot, the residues, the organic traces, had been lost in the process of cleaning and studying them. Balamká had escaped both of the forces that usually erase this kind of evidence: looters and time. The burn marks on the incense burners were still crisp. Residue still clung to the insides of bowls. Seeds and food remained still sat in the exact spots where they'd been left as offerings centuries before Europe's great cathedrals were built. This wasn't a curated museum collection. It was a real, unedited moment of worship locked in place. And as the team's lights moved across the incense burners, something unexpected came into focus. The faces staring back weren't Maya faces at all. They belonged to a rain deity associated with the great highland cultures of central Mexico, a figure recognizable by the heavy rings around his eyes and the long fangs at his mouth. A foreign god, found deep inside a Maya sanctuary, in the heart of Maya territory, where by every expectation he had no reason to be. That detail turned out to matter enormously. Finding imagery tied to a distant highland rain god inside a sacred Maya cave tells researchers something important about what kind of city Chichén Itzá actually was. This wasn't an isolated settlement guarding its own traditions in a vacuum. It was a crossroads, a place that absorbed ideas, deities, and artistic styles from far beyond its own region and wove them into its most sacred rituals. That blending had actually been visible on the surface all along, in the carved columns depicting warriors and serpent motifs whose styles echo those of far-off highland cities, patterns archaeologists had noted for years without being able to fully explain. What Balamká did was confirm, deep underground, in offerings no living person had seen in 1,000 years, the same story the surface architecture had been quietly telling all along. The city's identity wasn't singular. It was layered, absorbed, and reassembled from multiple traditions, and that fusion ran all the way down into the dark, sealed rooms nobody was ever meant to reopen. Alongside the incense burners, the team documented shells that had been carried inland from the coast, days of travel away, offered here because the ocean itself was understood as part of the same sacred water system that ran beneath the entire peninsula. They found jade, scattered bone fragments, and preserved plant remains, including maize, all of it sitting in place, waiting to be read rather than removed. That distinction, reading a site instead of emptying it, is the whole reason Balamká matters as much as it does. Organic material like seeds, food residue, and burned resin almost never survives in caves left open to air and moisture. It's exactly the kind of evidence that can answer the biggest questions: what people burned and when, what they ate, whether their offerings intensified during years when the rains failed. A sealed cave full of untouched organic material doesn't just prove people worshiped there. It can reveal when they came, what they feared, and what they were asking for. Back above ground, El Castillo has its own secrets that have nothing to do with hidden chambers, and they're worth remembering because they show just how intentional this entire site was. For staircases, one for each face of the pyramid, each with 91 steps. Add the platform at the summit, and the total comes to 365, the days of the solar year, carved directly into the architecture. 9 terraces, split by the 4 staircases into 18 faces, matching the 18 months of the Maya calendar. Twice a year, at the spring and fall equinox, the late afternoon sun strikes the edge of the northern staircase and casts a chain of triangular shadows that appear to slither downward, connecting at the base with carved stone serpent heads. The visual descent of the feathered serpent deity, achieved with nothing but sunlight geometry and extraordinarily precise understanding of the sky. And if you stand at the base of those same stairs and clap your hands, the echo that returns has been studied and confirmed by acousticians to closely resemble the call of a sacred bird whose feathers once adorned Maya rulers. The steps themselves act as an acoustic filter, turning an ordinary clap into something that sounds almost like birdsong. None of that is folklore. It's measurable, repeatable, and documented. Proof that the people who built the city understood astronomy, geometry, and acoustics well enough to encode all three into a single structure. Strip away the sensational headlines about secret chambers and treasure rooms, and what's actually been found beneath and around Chichén Itzá is something more interesting than any single hidden vault could be. There's a natural pool the builders treated as a gateway and oriented their greatest temple toward. There are two older pyramids folded inside the one visitors see today, one of them guarding a red jaguar throne that has sat undisturbed for centuries. There's a cave nearly 2 miles away holding more than 200 untouched offerings, arranged by hands that turned to dust 1,000 years ago, only now begin to give up their story one careful sample at a time. The real discovery here isn't a single secret room. It's the realization that the civilization built its world in layers. The living on top, water, and the dead below, and doorways deliberately placed between them, meant to be found only by people patient enough to crawl into the dark and look without disturbing what they found. The scans are real. The cave is real. The hidden pool beneath the pyramid is real. And somewhere in that quiet, sealed dark, the offerings at Balamká are still sitting exactly where they were left, slowly telling researchers what a great civilization feared and what it prayed for in its final centuries.